Hello, everybody out there in podcast video land. Welcome to the Drinking on Mars podcast, week 3. I hope you've been enjoying Drinking on Mars, the best of Patrick Flynn music from the 80s, 90s, zeros, teens, and today. That's original music, I might point out. Now, yes, as I said, I hope you've been enjoying week 3 and are ready for this week's podcast or episode or compendium where we kind of leave the 80s and move into the 90s. As my guests today, I'd like to welcome back Jonathan F., also known as Jonathan Flynn, who's guitarist and lead vocalist with Spaces Ace. And today we have a special guest, Nick Wilson, who joined Spaces Ace. Can't exactly remember when, Nick, in about 1989 or 1990, thereabouts, sometime lost in the mists of time. Welcome, Nick Wilson. You may know Nick from Clan Analog and Random Acts of Elevator Music and Entropy and many other bands. We'll talk about that a little bit at the end, Nick, about what you might have done since Spaces Ace and the dim dark past. But anyway, welcome both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, as our listeners will know, Spaces Ace was a kind of an electronic venture in a rock and roll pop world. It started out in Canberra in the late 80s with just John and I, and then eventually we met more and more musicians, and and gradually expanded. One of those musicians was you, Nick. So maybe do you want to set the scene of what you were doing back when we first met in Canberra? And how you came to be part of Spaces Ace and the world of Patrick Flynn.
Sure. So my recollection is it was 1988 when I met John. So I was I'd finished school, just finished year 12. I was working in the public service, as you do in Canberra, and trying to form bands, trying to find people to form bands with. And I saw a notice on the notice board in one of the musical instrument shops, and it was someone looking for a synth keyboard player. So I went around, and that was John's little ad. So I went around to his flat, and we had a couple of practice sessions. And I think my recollection is I didn't really quite get the electronic music sort of vibe that John was going for, at least not initially. So I was really into the Cure and Simple Minds and all the sort of post-punk new wave kind of stuff. And John had sort of I know John liked all that stuff, but he'd sort of gone ahead of that, and he was into Severed Heads and Pet Shop Boys and the kind of getting into all the dance music things. So I do have a recollection that we tried to play I Operated on My Own Brain, which was one of the early Spaces Ace songs, and John had the sequencer going, and I was sort of like, well, I'm a proper keyboard player, I can play that, you don't need that sequencer. And I tried to play it by doing some fancy octave stuff, and it didn't sound anywhere near as good as the sequencer. And then I think after that, John kind of thought, well, it's not quite the right aesthetic. So I think we stayed in touch following that, but that sort of delayed my journey into Spaces Ace. Then I went and formed another band, but we kind of, and then you guys got it up and running as a duo.
That's right.
Recollection, yeah.
Yeah, because that just prompted my memory, because I think that was before I'd even moved to Canberra, and kind of joined John and the Spaces Ace wagon train that you guys had kind of had those couple of jams together. Is that right, John?
I've completely forgotten about that. I think there was another guy came around as well who answered the ad, and I've forgotten his name. He didn't work out either, but he was kind of down for the whole electronic thing, but I don't know. He was a bit too quiet. He didn't have any ideas or any energy. He'd sort of sit back and wait for things to happen.
He's just waiting for computers to arrive so he could just sit in his bedroom on his own and program things.
I think he owned a synth, so that was something. But anyway.
Yeah, I think actually how I then got back in touch with you guys was because in those days, I mean, I still am I still try to be obsessed with the whole thing, right? Because you've got to stay motivated. But I started to form my next band, Deny, which turned into Denial, and really needed to get a demo recorded. And I knew that you had a 4-track, so I think I rang you up and asked if we could come over and record something with you, recording it on your 4-track. So I think that was my next sort of how I next hooked up with you, and then I think that kind of, and I think by that time, Patrick, I think you'd moved to Canberra.
I had moved to Canberra, and I remember Denial, and I remember the first time I saw you guys, which was playing a gig at the Chess Pit in Civic in Garima Place. So Denial was, you were on keys, in the Nick Rhodes role, classic 5-piece, right? You're on keys in the Nick Rhodes Duran Duran role. You had Neil Bateman on drums, who should be on this podcast now, but because he eventually became drummer and programmer in Spaces Ace at a later stage. We'll get to Neil later. Pete Burke, who will feature later in the Best of Patrick Flynn, because we've known Pete for years, not as long as you, Nick, but Pete played on many Spaces Ace records. I played with him in the later incarnations of the Von Trapp Family Slaughters, John. And then he and I have our teens project, To Keith Richards, which we will get to in the Drinking on Mars podcasts in a few weeks in future. But there's Robin Carey was on bass, and Pete was on guitar, and Deanne on vocals. So you probably told us. Deanna, that's right. Everybody was, 19 or younger?
Well, I was the oldest, and I think I was 19 by that point. Yeah.
So what was it like?
Everything about Denial is awesome. I mean, that's, but just emerging from Canberra, the stifling suburbs of Canberra, and you're a sort of like a Cure and Simple Minds fan, and the band's called Denial. It's absolutely perfect for the times. I think that's got to be a feather in your cap, Nick.
Okay. Yeah, it was like when Depeche Mode were in their very dark period in the late 80s. Their Berlin period. So that's what I was thinking of tonight. Yeah. So anyway, that's it's gone.
What was I going to say? How did Canberra's this kind of suburban sort of place, and was it like a reaction against that, Nick? Denial?
I don't know.
Measure up against.
I suppose I lived a kind of middle class kind of existence in the suburbs, and the sort of I guess it was a reaction against the blandness of middle class existence, maybe just on a personal level. I mean, I was really into all the kind of angsty Cure, Robert Smith, sort of Joy Division kind of thing of like, the weight of the world on your shoulders as a teenager. So, and music was a way of expressing that.
I think also around that time, Canberra had produced with the Falling Joys. There was, of course, the Doug Anthony All Stars, probably the most famous Canberra.
Yeah, the Falling Joys. Where
the other one that I really liked was New Waver. New Waver, who's this I don't know the background of New Waver, but New Waver just put out these cassettes and
was he Canberra? Because I got to know him in Melbourne actually, but was he originally from Canberra? Maybe he was.
I thought the backstory was that he was a public Canberra servant. I think that's the right. Okay. Maybe that was a fiction of it. I don't know. It could be a furphy.
But don't forget, there was also always a very big metal and hard rock scene in Canberra as well, which kind of coexisted alongside with that's the subgenre of kind of English pop music and electronica that we are trying to establish ourselves. I think
I always felt that the hard rock scene was it was kind of like, I don't know, we were natural enemies in a way, but I think we were open-minded because we did, after all, form a hard rock band ourselves as a side project.
That's right.
But I don't think any of the metalheads ever formed an electronic group as a side project.
but like wasn't your hard rock band more sort of in inverted commas? It was more of a sort of ironic hard rock band.
Well, of course it was ironic. But we did play Ace of Spades by Motorhead.
It was kind of like the guys that made Spinal Tap. Someone once asked them, it's like, oh, you must have a love-hate relationship with this music that you're satirizing, and they said, no, it's a love-love relationship. And I think it was a love-love relationship. We might have been taking the piss a bit. We still loved it.
Yeah. And all our friends did too. So many of them. All music is good.
Satisfy everyone.
Yeah.
Sure.
I just one final point just on this, although I want to maybe round out on, because we did all love that kind of English pop and electronic and European influence, and I think maybe we were reacting against the suburban Canberra life, Oz rock and pub rock, which was obviously the mainstay throughout the 80s of the Australian music scene. I personally, rejected that, and the kind of the culture of the fans that love that type of stuff as a 18, 19-year-old who was into goth and new wave and electronica. Of course, I must point out to the listening audience out there, I absolutely love it today, and acknowledge the classics that I was too young and naive to recognize back then. But I think at the time, that's what we were kind of rejecting, all of that as well.
You'll belt out a K-San karaoke as just as well as the next. As a 45-year-old, I recognize there's really a lot of truth about my life in that song I'm feeling right now, as I'm drifting north to check it out again.
Well, I think even if we can now appreciate all these other kinds of music that we, denigrated back then, I think there's still something to be said for doing something that's different from what everyone else is doing.
Absolutely correct. I was having the same thought. We might have had our prejudices and hatreds, or you can call them that, but in actual fact, we did what had to be done at the time. You can't do the same as what everyone else is doing.
Well, hate and the need to justify yourself is a very powerful motivator. I've discovered. I don't quite have that motivator anymore as a much older musician.
Hate's a bad word, but it's like, there's a certain amount of, it's like the whole disco suck thing or something like that. There's always going to be a dominant form of music you've got to react against that's just got too much money and too much popularity and too much hype, and it's too overdone. And it's absolutely righteous to fight against that.
Yeah, and that's what art does, throughout life. It's the fringe becomes mainstream, and then people react against that on the fringes, and it constantly evolves and moves forward. And I hope it continues to do so. And that's what Drinking on Mars is all about, that evolution and that movement and that idea of just having a crack and doing it yourself, because you love music or you love art or whatever, you love it so much you've just got to create for yourself.
Definitely.
Moving on. Very good, very interesting background there. So maybe we can just talk a little bit about some of the Spaces Ace tracks that straddle that period of late 88, 89, 90, 91, say. So the first one, I think what we're releasing this week is the Dr. Sex remix of Know It Now, I believe. So, sorry, I'll just pull it up here. Yes, Know It Now, the Dr. Sex remix. So Know It Now was one side of a double A-sided 7-inch single that we released. So I think that was probably 1989, could be 1990, I can't remember, but
I think that was 91. 91.
Okay. So we are definitely leaving the 80s. That's good to know. I think we might have released. Go on.
I'd rejoined the band.
And you rejoined the band. Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So tell us a little bit about your recollections of that time, Nick. I think we recorded in 2XX Studios, the local community radio station.
Yeah. So Jeremy / Dr. Sex, Jeremy Lee, he engineered the sessions. And actually, I think we recorded Statement of Intent first, and that was before Neil had joined. And then by the time we did Know It Now, Neil had joined.
Okay, yes, that makes sense then. So, statement of intent, which we will, whilst not an official track on Drinking on Mars, the album, it will be released as a midweek bonus track. So keep an eye on the Cheese and Crackers Music Fulfillment Center out there. All you listeners out there in TikTok, Mastodon, Facebook, PeerTube, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Spoutable. Keep an eye out for statement of intent. But yeah, okay. So we did statement of intent first, and that's much more the disco-ier, houseier influence track. So that makes sense that it was just the three of us on kind of keys, vocals, and bass, pretty much, and synths. But then when Know It Now is recorded, it's much more of a kind of a rockier, shoutier, angrier, guitarier track. And I think Neil might have programmed the drums on the Dr. Rhythm 110, was it, or the Dr. Rhythm 550?
The 550. I think it's a shame. It's a shame he's not here. He'd be able to set the record straight for sure. But I think that was my drum beat, and Neil was quite derisive of how rudimentary it is for him as a drummer. But he sort of approved of it at the same time. To a drummer, it was rudimentary, but for the song, something absolutely basic and primitive and completely repetitive seemed to be.
Yeah.
And did he play some tom patterns on the Octopad on that? I mean, he used to live to do that, but
no, I think they're all programmed into the Doctor.
Right.
They were actually. Yeah, that was all the DR550s toms.
Right.
Yeah, but he's not here, so we can talk about him. But I will point out that despite his derision, that was probably the start of his program, the beginning of his programming career, where he got very much into the technology over the subsequent years, and became an ace programmer on some of the later tracks.
The other thing I recall was the way we collaborated in writing it, because I think we'd always start off with a bass line and a drum beat, but then you sort of build the lyrics and melody on top of that. But I think I remember you, Nick, coming up with some of the lines. I think certainly the leather gear. I think the leather gear was your suggestion in our leather gear. You were always wearing leather. It was like, damn straight, we're all freaky people in our leather gear. I think that was your line.
Okay, I can't remember. I don't know, but
we did it. It was like Lennon and McCartney, knee to knee, eye to eye, throwing ideas back and forth at each other. It was quite a collaborative proposition, that one.
Neil must know we're talking about him because he's just about to join the podcast.
Right.
Excellent.
Right.
We'll have to backtrack.
Yes. So that song I recall as being the Stone Roses sort of influence, like that was a sort of a new thing.
Exactly. Yes, I think you're right too, because it's kind of a bit psychedelic. It's quite a lot psychedelic, actually, especially the original version, not the Dr. Sex version we listen to here. But welcome, Neil Bateman, to the Drinking on Mars podcast.
Sorry, I'm late. I never learned to read a clock.
That's okay. Your timing is perfect because we've just been talking about you, and
good.
and the recording session for Know It Now. Because we were just saying that we recorded Statement of Intent. That was the kind of Spaces Aces double A-sided single Know It Now and Statement of Intent. And we think that we'd recorded Statement of Intent kind of just as me, Nick, and John, and then you joined the band, and then kind of that we all worked on Know It Now together. And I thought you might have programmed the drum machine, the Dr. Rhythm 550, but John said he thinks that he programmed it, but you were derisive of it somewhat. On one hand, yes, it was good, but you're derisive of it as a drummer because it was just a simple pattern. Can you set the record? Can you set the record straight?
I can't remember.
Can you remember?
No, I can't. But I do remember playing some live drums on it. That's for sure.
All right. Okay.
Yeah. But we built more and more live drums as we went on. Because later on, you probably remember this, Neil. Remember we had a whopping great 100-watt speaker that we'd sit right next to your left ear and
With click
play
track.
a horrendous click track. So
Yeah.
you'd drum in time with the sequencer, because if you lose, if phase monitoring is bad and you lose that sequencer, then it's absolute chaos. And so by the end of it, it was full on live drum kit, really. That it was.
I remember early on in Canberra, I played standing up with like a big floor tom made out of a rubbish bin.
And the Octopad,
right.
didn't you have an Octopad?
I did, an Octopad,
Yeah.
big snare drum. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I didn't play with a full kit until we got to Sydney, I don't think.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But, and I think we might have even had, what was the Octopad hooked up to? It could be hooked up to.
It was hooked up. That was hooked up to the sampler. I was playing samples of it.
Yeah, you can
triggering all kinds of stuff. Yeah, it was good.
Yeah.
So what?
Yeah, so the beats are machine-like, but you're there with the creative, flair and the all the color and the spice.
Which I think for me is kind of emblematic of a couple of things. One, we were playing electronic music in a live music world, so we wanted to be. I personally definitely wanted to be kind of more live and put on more of a show and be maybe a bit more musical than machine-like. So, whereas John, I know you're the machine man, but the other thing I think is that transition from the statement of intent to Know It Now, and as Nick just said earlier, that it was more Stone Roses vibe, which I think is fantastic. There's the actual single.
So I was just looking at it. So we changed names between pressing the disc and doing the cover, because that's Space.
Yeah,
and this is Space is Ace.
That's probably why we got the stickers.
No. No, actually, yeah, it is. Space is Ace on there and Space on the cover. Anyway.
Yeah, because I've got one at home with the original sticker, the Space is Ace sticker, and then which was a round sticker, and then we took them all off and put those rectangular ones on. But I've actually got one of each. I've got one.
And that's the test pressing.
It's the butcher
This one's the test pressing.
Excellent.
And unfortunately, I used to have, I don't know if you guys have got it, I had the original artwork on.
No, I've got that.
You've got that now. Good. Okay,
I got
cool.
that still. Yeah, I had that framed. That was that artwork with Coca-Cola, the drink that allegedly helped the GIs win World War II. That was done by my friend Damien Totman from Orange, who eventually went on to become the creative director of Bloomberg International. And then the front cover, the red side, that was a photo taken by Jeremy Lee / Dr. Sex. So some very cool artwork right from the beginning. But what I was just going to say, just finally, just to round out this Know It Now discussion before we go into one of the next tracks, is I think, Neil, when you joined the band, that Stone Roses influence and that more of a show was the times impacting on us when we'd already had Acid House, and I think the indie dance crossover was beginning. So you had bands like Jesus Jones, and obviously Pop Will Eat Itself were a big influence. So standing up, playing drums, and playing the Octopad. It was kind of some of those influences starting to kind of sneak into the band. Stone Roses, Happy Mondays, all of that Manchester scene. I think
Jesus,
was happening. Jesus, well, they were even earlier in the 80s.
I think also, Patrick.
Go on, Nick.
I was just going to say, for statement of intent, I don't think there's any bass guitar on that. I think it was all like 303 and 202. So I think once myself and Neil were in the band, that sort of encouraged you to switch over to more bass guitar playing, and then you really kind of got into that on that particular, on Know It Now in particular, all the crazy bass solo stuff.
Lead bass.
Yes, there's that massive kind of big boomy, like Rennie style Stone Roses sounding bass segment, which is not really a bass line, but it's like a feature piece. And in the outro, in the original version of Know It Now, which I will make available somehow. The other couple of comments that I'd make about the Dr. Sex remix that I think are really interesting of Know It Now. Nick, I think I like your floaty keyboard stabs, the ethereal kind of Juno string synth, which is quite a feature, and also the remix that Jeremy did where at the end of the song in the back end, he just strips it right back to just that drum beat and delay, and it really, to me, brings out the Kraftwerk, roots of electronic music. Because thinking about it, sounds like, reminds me of Trans Europe Express, which is high praise, even if it comes from myself. But that's just my observations there.
I think just on a technical note, Nick, you might appreciate this, but I think he had an Ensoniq ASR10 sampler, and he just sampled the crap out of the whole thing and just played with the ASR effects. I think that's how it was done.
Yeah, and I think he did one remix just as a bit of a joke, and then we all thought it was good, and so then he then went. I think the version that you've made the video for is the second remix he did of that song,
right?
And then he went and remixed all the other ones as well. But I think the first one he was just messing around. And there was the line about you don't give a fuck or something, and he kind of did a giant reverb on the word fuck as a sort of just having a bit of a laugh at the whole thing.
Yes, well, the humor is definitely there in that it's this serious, silly, shouty protest electronic Jesus and Mary Chain, Jesus Jones song, but he drops in a Melissa Tkautz sample of Read My Lips just as it transitions from one section to the next, which I always found very funny. Look, my final comment on Know It Now and statement of intent is that it was reviewed in Beat magazine, I think it was, in Melbourne, as a single release whenever it was released, by well-known music journalist Craig Matheson, who's some of you old people may remember. I've read some of his books. Sell-In, I think, is a great book about music in the 90s. Now, he gave Space, or Space is Ace, whatever the moniker was, full moniker was, Know It Now statement of intent, single of the week in Beat magazine, Melbourne Street Press, very widely read. And there was another notable single that was reviewed in that week's column, and I'll put it up. And that single was by a little-known band called Nirvana with an obscure song called "Smells Like Teen Spirit." So, if we've achieved nothing in our lives, we've got single of the week over "Smells Like Teen Spirit." So, that's
and as a result of that, look what happened to Kurt Cobain. Tragic.
Oh, we're going to get hate from the Nirvana fans now. Maybe we'll say something nasty about Harry Styles, then we get some internet flaming. Moving on. Just a couple of other tracks that are coming up in future weeks, and we kind of well before we get there, just one track that is going to be on here a couple of weeks ahead is one called Dominoes, one of the more obscure Space is Ace tracks, because it was one of mine, and it wasn't a great song, but Jeremy did a really good, and it was really only ever recorded as a demo, but Jeremy did a great remix of it. So just wondering if you guys have any recollection of that actual track, if you listen to it in the lead up to this, or if you have any comments.
I have a bit of a recollection. So I remember coming over to your place and you'd written a song, and it was cool that there was a song that you were singing, Patrick. And my recollection is that you'd been listening to the Revenge album, the Peter Hook Water side project, which is actually a cool side project, I think, for Peter Hook.
Peter Hook.
Yeah. And so it was kind of made sense. Okay, well, the bass player can go and do a song of his own. Why not? But it was and you had all those like 909 snare fills and stuff, which I think was part of the kind of early house music sound. And I think Peter Hook had done a bit of that on the Revenge album. So and it was, and I think I do recall contributing a couple of lyrics to that song. I think there's a little kind of rap that you do, and I think there was a couple of maybe one or two words or lines or something that I threw in there somewhere.
Yes. Well, that is a very good assessment, I think, Nick, and I'd actually forgotten about that. But I mean, I love Peter Hook. He is a huge influence, and I'm a huge fan. And all of his side projects are actually all really good. It's quite tragic to see the New Order feud, but hey, they're like an old married couple.
Yeah.
Peter Hook. But you know, you actually definitely played piano on that as well, and that's in the final mix as well. There's some piano in there. Jeremy, when he did the remix of Dominoes, he actually threw away the whole first half of the song and just used the outro, which has got the rappy bit in it. And another actual feature of that track is that you can hear there's a guitar track in there in the background that was recorded by Pete Burke, or as he is credited, the Amazing Steaming Man, on guitar, with this kind of fluid, flowy, arpeggiated guitar, which is kind of a bit, you know, primal screamy, I guess, higher than the sun type of psychedelia of the time. And the Amazing Steaming Man was called the Amazing Steaming Man because being Canberra, it could get pretty cold at night. And I remember we saw the Pogues play at the ANU bar, an amazing gig where Shane McGowan was too drunk to sing or even stand up after one song. So the roadies tried holding him up, but he still couldn't do the show. So they carried him off. Spider Stacey did the rest of the show. Amazing gig, packed house, so hot. Everyone had a great time. Then we came outside and Pete was just steaming. Steam was coming.
He was so sweaty. Yeah, he was soaked in sweat. When he came out into the Canberra cold, the sweat just vaporized, all this steam coming on. Are you sure it was the Pogues? It could have been either the Violent Femmes or Pop Lead itself, because they were some fantastic ANU bar gigs as well from that era.
Or Public Image Limited as well. That was another fantastic one I remember from the same era. So who knows? A lot of great gigs back then. I guess that was another feature of playing music in a band in Canberra. I mean, we did get to see some really good touring acts in those days.
Although I don't think it would have been Pop Lead itself, because my recollection is the first time we went and saw Pop Lead itself, there was hardly anyone there, and I only went because you guys said this is a good band to go to, and I'd never heard of them. I think most Canberrans had never heard of them. So, but then they came another time about a year later and it was packed. But the first time they came,
another gig.
The first time the Pheromones were actually supporting them, which was, you know, with Helen Razor on lead vocals and Suzette, and Pete was playing guitar. The Amazing Steaming Man was on guitar with the support band for that first time around. Anyway, go on, John.
Oh, the other notable Canberra gig was De La Soul at the Queanbeyan Leagues Club, and there were only about 50 people there, which is, I only mention that now because of the sad death recently of Trugoy the Dove.
Yes.
They were great. They were great for the Queanbeyan Leagues. They should have been at ANU.
I missed that one, but whilst we're remembering, TISM, This Is Serious Mum, at, I think it was the Belconnen something or other club.
The Workers Club.
Yeah, yep. That was an amazing gig. And then there's Beats International, where I jumped up on stage during a song break and ran around the back of the stage where Norman Cook was at his DJ and gave him a copy of the Spirals for Eyes cassettes. And then his MC came over and said, "Hey, what's going on here, then? What's all this about? Look at this. Space is Ace. All right, yeah." Good on you for doing that. We're going to put that on the tour bus and have a listen. So, you know, all those kinds of shenanigans were good fun, as well as the rehearsing and the programming and the recording and the clubbing.
And Beats International got sampled for Statement of Intent, I think, didn't they, John?
Yes.
There was a Beats International sample on there.
Yes, they definitely
Jam Hot. I think this is Jam Hot. The sample.
Yeah, Tack Fly, Bosswalk, Jam Nitty Gritty. You're listening to the boy from the Big Bag City. This is Jam Hot. Yeah, which you sampled from somewhere else by Norman Cook, no doubt. Anyway, moving on. Now, I think we're in the track listing of Best of Patrick. We probably do. We're we're just talking a little bit about beyond week 3 now, and a couple of other tracks. Another more obscure track that actually never was released, but we actually did a pretty good demo of it that could have been polished up. Is a song. It's one of your songs, John, but I just wanted to put it on the desktop just because it's a really kind of an undiscovered gem or an unknown gem, and that's a song called Naked, which I think was around about that early 90s period when we were all still in Canberra, and I think it was still the 4 of us as well, and it really uses the 909, the TR-909 drum machine that, although probably for the first time that you'd bought. And I think it's got a lot of playing piano from you on it, Nick. Don't know if there's any bass or drums on it, Neil. So we were just in there.
It's all machines.
Machine, but that's me. Anybody got any comment to make on that particular track for the listeners out there in radio land and podcast land?
Well, I think the most notable thing about that, I mean, I think it's actually a really great song and one of the best from that era. And actually, even though I do like Jeremy's Dr. Sex remix, it would be nice to have the actual original song heard at some point, I think. But I think the notable thing is the stylophone solo that John...
Yes.
Because I'd never actually really heard of a stylophone until then. And then John turned up to the studio with this thing and played this very nice solo, which I think live I then kind of replicated on the synth, but on the recording it's the stylophone.
Yeah, it's an interesting hardware song, that one, because but the stylophone wasn't just any stylophone. It was the big grand piano style stylophone, the 230S. And I only recently I took it up to Gosford to there's a shop there, or was a shop there called Audio Active. It's sort of a fantastic synthesizer shop in Gosford of all places. And I traded it in for an OP1, that's right, which I then subsequently sold as well because I didn't like it either. But the other instrument in that was the sort of just like a one-note bass line, and that was the MKS50, which was the rack-mounted version of the Roland Super Juno. I just programmed the sound in, and it just sounded like a very, very technological sound. It was like naked technology, it was the technology without anything else. It was a very pure synth sound. So I called the preset Naked, and that's why the song's called Naked, purely because of the sound of just that one note. It's just based on a timbre, on a synth sound. So that's just synth programming,
Yeah,
it's great.
And I think my main contribution to that song, I think, is playing a little kind of few notes, which is actually I think that's the shamisen sound in the D20, because I inherited the D20 from John, and John was far more knowledgeable about synth programming than me, and said that we're not going to use any presets, but this is the one good preset in the D20. So, and I think Seven Heads had used it in a song. So,
here's another side story. It was I think it was in All Saints Day. What happened with All Saints Day? So I was later on the Twister bulletin board that was run by Tom Ellard. And I mentioned to him how much I enjoyed him using the Jamison preset from Roland synthesizers. And he said, "What? That's outrageous. I would never do such a thing. Never." He said, "It must have been Robert Rassick.
Right.
Because all those Seven Heads tracks were, he'd hand it over to Robert Rassick, and he'd be the one who'd funk them up and dance them up. And a lot of that credit, I think, goes to him. But anyway, It is still a fantastic sound. I haven't got it anywhere. I haven't got it anywhere. No, there's probably sample banks where you can get the Roland Jamison sample quite easily.
Yeah. Oh well, that's excellent. Now look, we're coming up close to the end of time, as in the end of our time together for this episode of the podcast. I think Neil, I'll definitely be, and John will probably be different. I'll definitely be talking to you in later episodes as we move from the kind of that 80s, late 80s, early 90s Canberra phase of Spaces 8 into the 90s, the 90s Sydney vintage space. And we have a lot more to talk about there, as there's the number of songs on Drinking on Mars coming up. So just wanting to wrap up, John, is there something you would want to say there, or? No, okay. So just as we wrap up, I wanted to put it to you guys to tell us and the listeners out there in podcast land what's you've done since the Spaces Ace days in kind of the 90s, what you did kind of thereafter, and what's something that you might be doing musically now. So Neil, maybe we start with you, because I know you've done some interesting stuff.
So I've been drumming in a band called Houlihan for about, I don't know, 20-something years. And
all of whom are from Canberra, and some of them
so all guys from Canberra.
Very well from those types.
Maybe were any of them on Embryo? I think they were. I think Dave was. So we've done a couple of albums, and I've done drums for another album that's coming up. Yep. Maybe this year, maybe next year when they get all their stuff done. Haven't played many gigs lately because of bloody COVID, but back into it.
and old age as well. But we'll put some links to Houlihan in the description below this.
It's quite a long running project, isn't it, Neil? It's been going for quite a few.
Yeah, since the late 90s. Yeah, we did have a bit of a break when we all went off and did other things, but got back together a while ago. Yeah. I think the last time I saw you play, Nick, was just before you got kicked out of an elevator in the city in Sydney.
Yep.
When you were busking.
That's a perfect segue for you to tell us.
Yeah. So that was Random Acts of Elevator Music, which was like a sort of a guerrilla ambient music project in the early 2000s. And we actually recorded an album of stuff between around 2003 and 2007, but actually just due to being, I don't know, slack or whatever, didn't actually release the album until 2017. But that album is actually now out if you want to check it out. But
links in the description, everybody.
Yeah, and I don't know, I've done a lot of different
Clan Analog work.
Yeah, well, Clan Analog is like, I sort of got involved in that as it's like a collective / label. So I'm considered the label manager, if making it sound slightly more professional than what it really is. So which kind of uses up a lot of my artistic energy on organization, which is kind of got its good side, because I find it's a good to have an outlet, but it also means that maybe I don't get time to do as much of my own music as I would like to. But I've got a new project, which is a solo thing called Reductionist, and which, I mean, it's a name I've used occasionally in the past, but I've got a whole new set. I did some gigs last year with a whole lot of like micro synths, I suppose you would call them, like Volkers and like little monotrons and stuff like that. So I've got a few videos on my YouTube channel.
Have you got Korg Little Bits? Little Bits?
Yeah, the Little Bits. Yeah, so I've put a whole bunch of videos on my YouTube channel. So maybe I'll share that link with you guys later on.
Please do.
Yeah.
And Jonathan, how about yourself?
Well, I've given up. We were always into fusion. I've kind of gone away from fusion. I don't know if fuse things anymore, so I've just kept myself busy with some electronic music production under various pseudonyms of Declan Stylophone and Declan Disco. And when I say I've given up fusion, I've made that like as purely electronic as possible. And I've also been delving into acoustic and folk music, doing the odd live performance. But they're both available at avonvilla.tk. Avon Villa is another pseudonym. avonvilla.tk has got the And in fact, they've been playing in the background on my monitor. I put up my
Yep.
There's a video experimentation as well. So I think that video technology is just in the last few years. It's kind of at the level that synthesizers were, at the turn of the 80s and 90s. It's completely accessible and something that you can play with, which is what I've tried to do in the videos that I've made, 30 years on for Space is Ace. So
that's right. And I mean, that's
about 5 videos, I think, to Drinking on Mars.
It's a significant component of the Drinking on Mars as a project. It's not just a kind of a greatest hits album, but it's also an exhibition of the fact that we can now quickly roll out these videos and construct these videos to go with the tracks, because the media of the day kind of demands that there's visuals to go with it, and that they're so easy to make and fun to make. But this project is also, it's kind of a history, an oral history as well, not just of me, but of all of us, and cultural history and what we've done. And I think as we go on, as an exploration of our love of music and of making music and writing music, and as musicians, it's another through line, and collaboration and independence. But there's a through line of not just love of music, the love of making music, but the focus on the technology of making music as well, which we're talking a lot about. And as we go through the decades, it's going to be interesting when we start to get into computers, because I'm sure we'll have some interesting discussions where I'll have a lot to say about that business, the activity of making music, as we get into the pure digital age and the internet age, and YouTube and software. That's quite amazing. So with that, I will bid everybody farewell, and I'd like to thank you, Jonathan, Nick, Neil. We'll see you again probably on the Drinking on Mars podcast. Goodbye to everybody out there in podcast land. Keep listening to the podcast. New tracks coming out every Friday. Just go to the Cheese and Crackers Music Fulfillment Center on YouTube, or your favorite social media platform, but especially on YouTube, and subscribe so you don't miss any videos, like and share. That, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Farewell.
Thanks for having me.
No problem.
Farewell.